On a warm Saturday evening, a young black couple, Jamal and Aisha, decided to celebrate their third anniversary at one of the most talked-about restaurants in the city. They had been looking forward to this special night for weeks, planning every detail of their evening, from what they would wear to the reservation they had secured in advance. The restaurant had a reputation for its sophisticated ambience, delicious cuisine, and exclusive atmosphere. It was the perfect place to enjoy a romantic dinner and make lasting memories. As they approached the front of the restaurant, Jamal held Aisha's hand tightly, smiling at her. She looked stunning in a beautiful black dress, and he couldn't help but feel proud to be her partner. Aisha, in turn, smiled back, her excitement matching his. Both of them were dressed to the nines, Jamal in a sharp, well-tailored suit, and Aisha in her elegant dress, with her hair styled perfectly. They were ready for a night that was supposed to be about celebrating love, but they had no idea what was waiting for them inside. When they arrived, the entrance was busy with guests coming and going, but as they walked up to the hostess stand, they were greeted with an unexpected, strange silence. The hostess, a young woman with a neutral expression, looked them up and down, not with a warm smile or the usual greeting, but with a cold, almost dismissive glance. Jamal and Aisha exchanged a look, sensing that something was off, but they didn't want to let it ruin their mood. Reservation? The hostess asked flatly as she checked the list. Yes, under the name Williams, Jamal replied, his voice calm but his eyes alert to the tension in the air. The hostess scanned the list briefly, then looked up with a slightly raised eyebrow. Ah, yes, right this way, she said, though her tone was lacking the usual warmth. She led them inside, but it was clear from her body language that she wasn't exactly happy to have them there. Jamal and Aisha followed her, trying to brush off the discomfort they were feeling. As they made their way through the elegant dining area, they couldn't help but notice that the other patrons were staring at them, whispering amongst themselves. The feeling of being out of place grew stronger, but they tried to shake it off. They had reserved a table and were there to enjoy their evening, not to focus on the discomfort that was clearly building around them. The hostess led them to a table in the back corner of the restaurant, away from the other guests. It was a bit isolated, but they didn't think much of it at first. After all, it was a quiet spot, perfect for an intimate dinner. However, as they sat down and the hostess handed them the menus, the tension in the air was undeniable. The couple exchanged a glance, wondering if they were just being overly sensitive, but the vibe was unmistakable. They couldn't help but feel like they were being treated differently from the other customers. As they perused the menu, the restaurant owner, a man in his late 50s with a stern face and slicked back hair, suddenly appeared beside their table. His presence was imposing, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. Without so much as a greeting, he looked at Jamal and Aisha and said, "I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Jamal looked up, confused, thinking it was some kind of misunderstanding. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice calm but beginning to show signs of confusion. The owner, with an air of authority, repeated himself, this time louder. "I said, you need to leave. This isn't the place for you. You're not dressed appropriately, and I'm afraid we cannot serve you." His words were blunt and full of contempt, and it was clear that he wasn't interested in hearing any explanation. Aisha's heart sank as she looked at Jamal, unsure of what had just happened. They had followed the dress code precisely, dressed impeccably for the occasion, but somehow they were being asked to leave without any clear reason. "But we made a reservation," Aisha said quietly, trying to reason with him, but the restaurant owner wasn't having it. "I don't care about your reservation. You're causing a disturbance," he snapped, his voice harsh. The couple felt a wave of humiliation wash over them. They had been looking forward to this night, but now it felt like they were being treated as though they didn't belong there, as though they were not worthy of a seat at this exclusive establishment. Jamal stood up, his face red with frustration, and Aisha followed suit, her eyes filled with disbelief. She wanted to cry, but she held back the tears, trying to remain composed. "I think we should go," Jamal said softly, taking Aisha's hand. They had no choice but to leave. They turned to walk out of the restaurant, their hearts heavy with the sting of injustice. As they left, the owner didn't even offer an apology or an explanation. He just stood there, watching them go. Jamal and Aisha exited the restaurant, their heads held high despite the embarrassment. They were shaken, but they refused to let the owner's actions ruin their evening. They couldn't understand what had just happened, but they knew they had been treated unfairly. The night that had been meant for celebration had now turned into a painful memory, one that neither of them would soon forget. Little did they know, this incident was just the beginning of a much larger story that would soon unfold in ways they could never have predicted. The next morning, Jamal and Aisha woke up still feeling the weight of the previous night's events. They had spent hours tossing and turning, unable to shake the sting of being humiliated in front of strangers. The whole situation felt surreal. They were still struggling to comprehend what had happened, how they had been treated differently simply because of who they were. Despite the discomfort, they both knew they had to move forward. But the feeling of being wronged lingered. As the day went on, they each turned to their phones, hoping to distract themselves, but that was when everything began to take a turn. The story about the incident began to spread. Aisha, still trying to process what had happened, decided to post about their experience on social media. She shared a heartfelt message, detailing how they had been treated unfairly by the restaurant owner. She included the fact that they had followed the dress code, made a reservation, and tried to reason with the staff, but were still asked to leave for no reason other than what seemed like discrimination. At first, she wasn't sure if anyone would even notice, but within hours, the post went viral. The messages of support came flooding in from old friends, new acquaintances, and even strangers. People were outraged. It wasn't just the unfair treatment of Jamal and Aisha. It was the realization that such things were still happening in today's world. The couple's story touched a nerve, and the flood of anger against the restaurant owner's actions was overwhelming. Jamal and Aisha hadn't expected this. They had hoped for a simple acknowledgement or apology from the restaurant, but what they got was much bigger than that. Their story became a symbol of the larger problem of inequality that so many people still face daily. Messages flooded in from people all over the country, many sharing their own stories of discrimination, some in restaurants, others in workplaces, or even in their everyday lives. The support from the public gave them a sense of comfort, but it didn't change the reality they faced. The humiliation still stung. By the afternoon, a local news outlet picked up the story. The reporter interviewed the couple about their experience, and the story was broadcasted online and across television stations. Jamal and Aisha spoke passionately, not just about the hurt they felt, but about how they hoped this story would encourage others to stand up against discrimination, no matter where it occurred. They didn't want their experience to be in vain. They wanted to use it as a stepping stone to inspire change. The restaurant, on the other hand, was not prepared for what came next. At first, the owner tried to stay quiet, hoping the storm would pass. He thought the media would move on to the next story, and everything would go back to normal. But the backlash only grew. It wasn't just the online comments or the news stories. Customers began posting negative reviews on every platform they could find. Former patrons, who had once loved the restaurant, started sharing their own experiences and voicing their disappointment. Many said they would no longer dine there and urged others to follow suit. The restaurant's social media accounts became filled with angry messages and reviews. One after another, people expressed their outrage at the owner's behavior, calling him out for his discriminatory actions. Some said they would have expected more from such an esteemed restaurant, especially one that had always prided itself on its exclusive atmosphere. What was meant to be a place of luxury was now being viewed by many as a symbol of inequality. In a matter of hours, the restaurant's reputation was crumbling. People began to boycott the place. The owner, who had once walked with confidence, now found himself pacing nervously in his office, trying to figure out what to do next. It was clear that his business was in danger, but the real weight of the situation was beginning to sink in. The restaurant wasn't just losing customers, it was losing its integrity. Customers weren't just angry about the couple's treatment. They were upset about what the incident represented. Jamal and Aisha didn't let the growing media attention change their focus. They had a purpose now, to ensure that no one else would experience what they had gone through. As the couple continued to share their story, they were heartened by the sheer number of people who stood with them. What started as a small post about their pain had blossomed into a larger movement. People from all walks of life were speaking up, and the couple's voices had become a catalyst for conversation on social media and beyond. Despite the public outcry, there was a deeper question that remained unanswered. Would the restaurant owner take responsibility for his actions? Would he apologize and make amends, or would he continue to ignore the truth that was now staring him in the face? Jamal and Aisha weren't sure what the next step would be. All they knew was that they had sparked something much larger than they could have ever anticipated, and they wouldn't back down now. At the end of the day, they sat together in silence, reflecting on everything that had happened. They had wanted a peaceful night out to celebrate their love, but instead, they had found themselves at the center of a conversation that would change how people looked at discrimination in their community. And while they still felt the sting of the previous night's events, they knew that in some way, they had already begun to turn the tide. As the days passed, the backlash against the restaurant grew stronger. What had initially seemed like a small incident had now spiraled into a public relations nightmare. The restaurant's phone lines were flooded with angry calls. Some customers demanded a full explanation from the owner, while others threatened to never set foot in the establishment again. The reviews online, which once praised the restaurant for its fine dining and exclusive ambience, had turned negative, with many people leaving one-star ratings and expressing their anger at the owner's actions. The story of Jamal and Aisha's mistreatment had captured the public's attention, and it wasn't just the local community that was outraged. Social media had turned into a place where people from across the country were sharing the story, offering support to the couple and condemning the restaurant for its discriminatory behavior. It was clear that the couple's experience was a reflection of a much larger issue, and now people weren't just angry at the restaurant. They were angry at the inequality that still existed in society. The media coverage only added to the pressure the restaurant was facing. News outlets ran the story, interviewing experts on racial discrimination and speaking with community leaders about the importance of creating inclusive spaces for everyone. The story spread quickly, gaining traction on national news channels. The couple's strength in speaking out was being praised everywhere. They had not only shared their painful experience, but had also used their platform to start an important conversation about fairness and respect. As the pressure mounted, the restaurant owner, Mr. Daniels, was forced to address the situation. He scheduled a press conference to speak to the public, hoping to quell the storm and salvage his business. The owner appeared on television with a strained expression, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. His words, however, did little to calm the situation. He claimed that there had been a misunderstanding, that the couple had not been following the dress code, and that the situation was blown out of proportion. But his attempts to brush off the incident were met with disbelief. Jamal and Aisha, who had been watching the press conference from the comfort of their living room, exchanged frustrated looks. They knew the truth, and hearing Mr. Daniels try to downplay the situation made them feel even more disrespected. It was clear to them that the restaurant owner wasn't genuinely remorseful. He wasn't accepting responsibility for his actions or acknowledging that his behavior had been rooted in prejudice. Instead, he was trying to protect his business and his reputation at all costs. The couple knew that the restaurant's apology needed to be sincere, and the owner's attempt to cover up the truth was only making things worse. Meanwhile, the boycott against the restaurant continued to grow. People were sharing their own stories of discrimination, of times they had been treated unfairly in similar situations, and they were all rallying around Jamal and Aisha. It wasn't just about the couple anymore. It was about creating a world where everyone was treated equally and with dignity. The negative reviews continued to pour in, not just on the restaurant's website, but across every review platform. Yelp, Google, TripAdvisor, all of them were filled with comments condemning the owner's actions. Some customers posted that they would never visit the restaurant again, while others shared their own experiences of discrimination in the past. It was clear that the community was fed up, and many patrons who had once been loyal to the restaurant were now taking a stand. In response, the restaurant's public relations team tried to mitigate the damage. They reached out to influencers and food bloggers, offering them free meals in exchange for positive reviews. They hoped that by appeasing these influential voices, they could turn the tide in their favor. However, their efforts were in vain. The damage had been done. No amount of free meals or staged apologies would erase the hurt that had already been caused. Jamal and Aisha, despite the emotional toll, remained calm. They weren't interested in taking advantage of the situation for personal gain. What they wanted was for the owner to truly understand what he had done wrong and to take real action to make amends. They believed that apologies were meaningless without change, and they were determined to keep the spotlight on the issue of racial discrimination until something tangible was done. The couple's next move was to speak directly with local community leaders, activists, and organizations. They met with people who had spent years working to address systemic inequality. These conversations reinforced their belief that the fight for justice wasn't just about one night at a restaurant. It was about an ongoing battle to ensure that no one else would have to face the same kind of unfair treatment. Jamal and Aisha also participated in interviews with major media outlets where they continued to speak about their experience with grace and dignity. They didn't want to be seen as victims, but as people who were using their voices to stand up for what was right. They weren't looking for sympathy. They were looking for action. And through these interviews, they reached an even wider audience, further spreading the message that everyone, regardless of their race or background, deserves to be treated with respect. In the midst of all this, Jamal and Aisha received a formal invitation from the restaurant owner to meet privately. He wanted to apologize in person, claiming that he had come to realize the gravity of his mistake. While hesitant at first, the couple agreed to meet. They didn't know what to expect, but they hoped that this meeting might lead to the kind of change that was long overdue. The invitation from the restaurant owner, Mr. Daniels, came as a surprise to Jamal and Aisha. They had been so focused on sharing their story and advocating for change that they hadn't expected him to reach out. The couple discussed the offer, unsure of what to expect. Despite the anger they still felt, they agreed to meet with him. It wasn't for an apology alone. They wanted to make sure that what had happened to them would never happen again to anyone else. The meeting was arranged at a neutral location, a quiet cafe that allowed for privacy. Jamal and Aisha arrived early, sitting down at a corner table and discussing the situation. While they had both been hurt by the incident, they were determined not to let their emotions cloud their judgment. They were prepared for the worst, but they hoped for the best. A genuine apology and a commitment to making things right. When Mr. Daniels arrived, he looked noticeably uncomfortable. His usual confident demeanor was replaced with a cautious uncertainty. He was dressed in a business suit, but there was no mistaking the nervousness that lingered in his expression. He extended his hand to Jamal and Aisha, and they exchanged brief, stiff handshakes. "I appreciate you both agreeing to meet with me," Mr. Daniels began, his voice steady but lacking the usual conviction. "I realize that what happened was a mistake, and I want to apologize. I was wrong, and I can see how deeply I hurt you both." Jamal and Aisha listened carefully, trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. Aisha, who had been the more vocal of the two, spoke first. "It's not just about the apology, Mr. Daniels. It's about understanding what happened and why it happened. You treated us like we didn't belong there. And that's not something that can be fixed with a few words. We need real change." Mr. Daniels nodded, his face tinged with regret. "I understand. I wasn't thinking clearly in the moment. I let my own biases get in the way of treating you both with respect. And for that, I'm truly sorry." The couple remained silent for a moment. Jamal took a deep breath and continued, "We don't want this to be just about us. We want to see a change. We want to know that you're committed to making sure this never happens again, not just for us, but for everyone." Mr. Daniels seemed to process their words, his gaze dropping to his coffee cup for a few moments. Then, looking up, he said, "I've been thinking a lot about this, and I know it's not enough to just apologize. I want to make this right, but I also know I need to do more than just say the right things. I've already begun looking into diversity training for all of my staff, and I plan to make some changes in how we approach customer relations moving forward. I want to make sure everyone who walks through those doors feels welcome, no matter who they are." Jamal and Aisha exchanged a look. It was clear that the owner was trying, but the couple wasn't ready to give him full credit just yet. "Diversity training is a good start," Aisha said cautiously, "but it's just a start. You need to actively listen to people of color and make sure your restaurant becomes a place where everyone feels truly comfortable and respected." Mr. Daniels nodded again, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. I know I've got a lot of work to do. I've already reached out to experts in diversity and inclusion to help guide the process. It's going to take time, but I'm committed to doing it. I don't want my restaurant to be a place where anyone feels like they're unwelcome. It's the right thing to do." As the conversation continued, Jamal and Aisha pressed further. They asked him what specific actions he would take to ensure the restaurant became a more inclusive space. Would he address the staff directly about the incident? Would he change the way the restaurant handled reservations and seating arrangements? Would he make sure that people of color weren't treated differently from other customers? Mr. Daniels listened carefully and responded thoughtfully. "I'm going to have a staff meeting to address what happened and make it clear that any kind of discrimination, intentional or not, will not be tolerated. I want to create a space where everyone feels valued, and I'm going to make sure that the changes we implement come from a place of genuine respect." It wasn't an easy conversation, and Jamal and Aisha knew that the road ahead would be challenging. But they also knew that they had made a difference. Their decision to speak out had sparked a larger conversation about fairness and respect, and it was clear that for the first time, the restaurant owner was beginning to realize the depth of his mistake. The couple wasn't ready to forgive and forget just yet, but they acknowledged that Mr. Daniels was making an effort. They left the cafe feeling a sense of cautious optimism. They knew that change would take time, and they weren't going to let him off the hook easily. But the first steps had been taken, and that gave them a sense of hope. As they left the cafe, Aisha turned to Jamal and said, "It's a start, but we'll be watching to make sure this isn't just empty talk. We need action." Jamal smiled, squeezing her hand. "We'll make sure of it. This is just the beginning." And with that, they walked out into the bright afternoon, knowing that their fight for justice wasn't over. It had only just begun. In the days following their meeting with Mr. Daniels, Jamal and Aisha couldn't shake the feeling that their work was far from over. While the restaurant owner had promised to make changes, they knew that real change would take time, and that actions would speak louder than words. They were determined to hold him accountable for the promises he had made. They couldn't allow this situation to be swept under the rug or reduced to a few nice gestures that didn't actually address the deeper issues. The couple continued to share their story, not because they wanted to relive the hurt, but because they knew how important it was to keep the conversation going. They wanted people to understand that racism wasn't just about one bad experience. It was a pattern, a system that needed to be dismantled. And that couldn't happen unless they continued to speak out and make sure that their voices were heard. Jamal and Aisha both received messages from people who had been following their story, many of whom expressed admiration for how the couple had handled everything. They were encouraged by the way Jamal and Aisha had used their platform to advocate for change, and many shared their own stories of similar experiences. The couple realized that their experience, while painful, had sparked something much larger than they had anticipated. It wasn't just about their own situation. It was about addressing systemic issues and creating a ripple effect of change. Meanwhile, Mr. Daniels was still working on his end to make amends, but the pressure from the public remained constant. He kept his word and organized staff meetings to discuss the importance of diversity and inclusion, but Jamal and Aisha weren't sure if those efforts were enough. They didn't want to hear about meetings. They wanted to see real actions, real changes. They knew that the staff needed to be educated not only on what had happened, but on how to make sure nothing like it would ever happen again. Words were easy, but real change took more effort than a single meeting. The restaurant was still struggling to recover from the backlash. Though Mr. Daniels had made efforts to appease customers, the damage to the restaurant's reputation couldn't be undone overnight. It was becoming clear that many of the restaurant's regular patrons were not returning. Some didn't want to be associated with a place that had been publicly accused of discrimination. Others just didn't feel comfortable dining in a restaurant that had been in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. Jamal and Aisha were aware of the challenges the restaurant owner faced. They weren't seeking to punish him. They just wanted to make sure that the restaurant could learn from the mistake and become a better, more inclusive place for everyone. They didn't want anyone else to feel the way they had felt that night. They knew that this wasn't just about a personal apology or the restoration of one business's reputation. It was about creating lasting change, not just in the restaurant, but in the community as a whole. One afternoon, they received a message from a local community leader who had been following their story. This leader, a woman named Lisa, had been involved in efforts to address inequality in the local business community for years. She offered to meet with Jamal and Aisha to discuss the issue further. When they met, Lisa shared her own experiences of facing discrimination and talked about how important it was for businesses to take responsibility for their actions. Lisa was involved in training programs for businesses, helping them become more inclusive and aware of their biases. She believed that the situation with the restaurant could be used as an example for broader change. Lisa suggested that they take the lead in helping the restaurant get back on track. She proposed hosting a community event where Mr. Daniels could publicly acknowledge the incident, not just with an apology, but by demonstrating his commitment to creating a more inclusive environment. The event would give the community a chance to see that the restaurant was serious about making change, and it would allow people to voice their concerns in a safe and productive way. It was an opportunity to turn the negative experience into something positive, a chance for healing and growth. Jamal and Aisha were intrigued by the idea. It would be a difficult conversation, but they believed that it could lead to meaningful change. They approached Mr. Daniels with the suggestion, and though he was initially hesitant, he ultimately agreed. He knew that the community had lost trust in his restaurant, and this event could be a way to start rebuilding that trust. The planning began, and the event was set for a week later. Jamal and Aisha were both nervous and hopeful. They weren't sure how the community would respond to the restaurant's efforts, but they knew it was the right thing to do. It wasn't just about saving the restaurant. It was about creating a space where people felt seen, heard, and respected. On the day of the event, the restaurant was packed. People from the community, local business owners, and activists gathered to hear what Mr. Daniels had to say. The tension in the air was palpable, but so was the sense of anticipation. Mr. Daniels stood at the front of the room, his hands slightly trembling as he addressed the crowd. He spoke earnestly, acknowledging the hurt that had been caused, not just to Jamal and Aisha, but to anyone who had ever been made to feel unwelcome. He explained the steps he had taken to address the issue within his restaurant and the ongoing training that would continue. But most importantly, he made a promise to continue working with the community to ensure that this kind of behavior would never happen again. Jamal and Aisha sat in the audience, watching with cautious optimism. They knew that the event wasn't a perfect fix, but it was a step in the right direction. It was a sign that the conversation was changing, that people were beginning to understand that the issue wasn't just about one bad night. It was about a broader commitment to fairness and respect. As the event ended, there was a sense of relief in the room. People thanked Mr. Daniels for his honesty and offered their support for the future of the restaurant. Jamal and Aisha left the event feeling that they had played a part in something important. They didn't know what the future held, but they were hopeful that this was just the beginning of a broader movement toward change in their community. After the community event, things began to shift. The restaurant, once at the center of controversy, had now opened the door to change. Mr. Daniels had done what many people had thought was impossible. He had acknowledged the hurt he caused and taken real steps to make things right. Still, Jamal and Aisha knew that this was just one step in a much longer journey. The public's eyes were still on the restaurant, watching to see whether the promises made would be kept. The couple had seen the first sign of progress, but they weren't ready to let their guard down just yet. They kept a close eye on the restaurant, curious to see if the changes promised during the community event would truly take shape. They continued to use their platform to highlight the importance of accountability and to encourage businesses to embrace diversity and inclusivity in meaningful ways. For weeks following the event, there was a noticeable difference in the atmosphere at the restaurant. New signs were put up, promoting inclusivity and respect for all customers. The staff seemed more attentive, and there was a genuine effort to make the space feel welcoming for everyone who walked through the doors. The diversity training that had been promised was being implemented, with staff members taking part in workshops designed to help them understand unconscious biases and how to avoid them in their interactions with customers. Jamal and Aisha had been cautiously optimistic, but now, as they saw the changes happening, they began to feel a sense of hope. The couple wasn't looking for perfection. What mattered was the genuine effort being put in to make things better. They had expected pushback, but instead, they saw a transformation. Staff members, who had once been indifferent or unaware, were now engaging with customers in a way that felt warmer and more respectful. A few weeks later, Jamal and Aisha decided to revisit the restaurant. They wanted to see firsthand how things had changed. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about checking if the restaurant's efforts matched their words. They walked in together, not expecting special treatment, but just wanting to see if the atmosphere felt different. When they entered, they were greeted by the hostess with a smile, and their reservation was confirmed without issue. It wasn't the cold reception they had received months ago. As they sat down, they noticed subtle changes. The staff seemed more relaxed and friendly, and the decor was subtly different, with signs reminding everyone about the importance of diversity and respect. It felt like a different place, one that had learned from its past mistakes. As they enjoyed their meal, they observed how the staff interacted with other customers. There was a sense of openness and warmth that hadn't been there before. Jamal and Aisha both agreed that this was a positive sign, but they also knew that it was still a work in progress. Real change takes time, and while the atmosphere was better, the true test would be in the long-term commitment to these changes. As they finished their meal, Mr. Daniels himself came over to greet them. He seemed more relaxed now, no longer the nervous man they had met earlier. "I'm really glad you decided to come back," he said with a genuine smile. "I hope you can see that we're trying. We've made some changes, but there's still more to do. I really appreciate you both giving us a chance to make things right." Jamal and Aisha exchanged a glance. They appreciated his honesty, and while they still had their reservations, they could see that he was being sincere. "It's a step in the right direction," Aisha replied, "but you need to keep pushing for more. This isn't a one-time fix. You've got to keep this going." Mr. Daniels nodded. "I know. It's a commitment, not just to you, but to everyone who comes here. And we're going to keep working on it. I want this to be a place where everyone feels welcome." As they left the restaurant that evening, Jamal and Aisha felt a quiet sense of pride. They had fought for something they believed in, and they had made a difference. It wasn't just about the restaurant anymore. It was about the broader impact they had on their community. They had sparked a conversation that had made people reconsider how they treated others, regardless of race, background, or appearance. In the weeks that followed, Jamal and Aisha continued to hear from people who had visited the restaurant and experienced the changes for themselves. Many of them expressed their gratitude, saying they had noticed a significant improvement in the way they were treated. Some shared their own stories of being treated unfairly in similar situations, and the couple encouraged them to keep speaking out. They had learned an important lesson along the way. Change doesn't happen overnight, but with persistence, it can happen. They had faced discrimination, but instead of letting it defeat them, they had turned it into an opportunity to create something better. They had worked hard to hold the restaurant accountable, and in doing so, they had helped start a larger conversation about fairness, equality, and respect. While they knew that there would always be challenges ahead, Jamal and Aisha were hopeful. They had shown that one couple, by speaking up and standing their ground, could make a difference. They hadn't just stood up for themselves. They had stood up for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. And as they moved forward, they felt empowered, knowing that they had played a role in changing things for the better. As the months passed, Jamal and Aisha noticed a gradual but significant shift in the atmosphere around them. The restaurant, which had once been a symbol of frustration and hurt, was now beginning to feel like a place of hope and possibility. They had walked into the restaurant several times since their first return, each time noticing more improvements. There was a palpable sense of openness now, one that hadn't existed when they had first visited. Jamal and Aisha had become somewhat regular visitors, not because they were trying to keep an eye on the restaurant, but because they had genuinely seen the changes taking place. Staff were more attentive, the space felt more inclusive, and the owner himself seemed more at ease. The couple's decision to return had been a big step for them, and it had given them a deeper sense of satisfaction, seeing their efforts result in real change. However, they remained realistic. Change, no matter how much progress had been made, was still a long road ahead. They knew that staying vigilant was key, and they continued to encourage others to speak out about discrimination wherever they saw it. During this time, the local community began to shift as well. Jamal and Aisha were invited to several events where they shared their story, speaking about the lessons they had learned, not just about racism, but about the importance of standing up for what was right. They used their platform to help others find their voices, encouraging people to challenge unfair treatment and be brave enough to call out wrongs when they saw them. It was a ripple effect. People were learning to recognize discrimination in their own lives, and they were taking action to address it. But despite the growing support, Jamal and Aisha knew they weren't done yet. They had made a significant impact at the restaurant, but their larger mission was to create change in the community as a whole. Their work wasn't finished because systemic issues of inequality and prejudice couldn't be fixed by one incident or by one restaurant alone. There was still so much to be done. One evening, after a long day of meetings and events, Jamal and Aisha sat down together at their kitchen table, reflecting on everything they had accomplished so far. The weight of it all hadn't hit them until now. They had fought for justice, spoken out against discrimination, and witnessed change happening right in front of their eyes. It was something they hadn't expected when they first walked into that restaurant all those months ago. Back then, they had been angry and confused, unsure of what would happen next. Now they could see how far they had come. "I can't believe how much has changed," Aisha said softly, staring out the window. "It feels like we've been part of something bigger than we could have imagined." Jamal nodded in agreement, his eyes thoughtful. "We've made a difference, but it's just the beginning. There are still so many people out there who need to feel heard, who need to know they're not alone." They knew the battle wasn't over. As much as they had seen positive change, they also knew that there were many others who had yet to have their voices heard. There were still people experiencing the same kind of discrimination they had faced, and while they had made a dent, there was still work to be done to make sure that the changes they had fought for would continue. A few days later, Jamal received an email from Mr. Daniels. The restaurant owner wanted to meet again, this time to discuss how they could continue moving forward together. He'd heard about some of the community outreach work Jamal and Aisha had been doing, and he wanted to see how they could collaborate on future projects to address inequality in the area. He understood now that the work wasn't just about making his restaurant more welcoming. It was about being part of a broader effort to create a more inclusive community. Jamal and Aisha agreed to meet, eager to see how the restaurant's owner intended to continue the progress they had helped begin. When they sat down with Mr. Daniels, he was different from the man they had first encountered. There was no defensiveness in his tone, no need to protect his business. Instead, he was genuinely interested in learning how he could make a positive impact. He had already implemented more policies at the restaurant, including outreach programs that focused on hiring people from diverse backgrounds. He had even begun working with local charities to fund programs for underprivileged communities. "I want to do more," Mr. Daniels said. "The changes we've made here have been a start, but I know that's not enough. I want to contribute to something larger, something that helps everyone." Jamal and Aisha felt encouraged by his words. They had always known that real change had to come from the top down, but it was inspiring to see someone who had been so resistant to change now embracing it fully. They discussed ideas for future initiatives, including partnering with local schools to provide mentorship opportunities for young people of color and creating workshops that would bring together people from different backgrounds to learn from one another. The conversation was a reminder that change could happen, even when it seemed impossible. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast, but it was happening. Jamal and Aisha felt a renewed sense of hope, knowing that their efforts had sparked a shift that was starting to ripple outward. The journey they had begun was far from over, but they now had the support of people who wanted to make a difference alongside them. As they left the meeting, hand in hand, they both knew that their fight wasn't finished. But they were no longer just a couple trying to right one wrong. They were part of a larger movement, one that was slowly, but surely, changing the way people saw one another. The road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but Jamal and Aisha had learned that no matter how difficult the journey, it was always worth it if it meant standing up for what was right. As time went on, Jamal and Aisha continued to see the fruits of their hard work. The ripple effect from their efforts didn't just stop at the restaurant. They were invited to speak at schools, businesses, and community events about their journey, sharing their story of how one incident had transformed into a movement for greater inclusivity. Their words resonated with many, especially in places where inequality was still prevalent. People saw them not as victims, but as leaders in a fight for fairness, a fight that could only be won if everyone came together. Jamal and Aisha's commitment to the cause grew stronger each day. They weren't just telling their story anymore. They were actively involved in creating positive change. They continued to partner with organizations that focused on diversity and inclusion, working with local schools to raise awareness about unconscious bias and the importance of embracing differences. They knew that true change wouldn't happen until children and young adults understood how to treat others with kindness and respect, no matter their background. Their efforts also started to influence other businesses. More and more local restaurant owners reached out to them, seeking advice on how to make their own establishments more inclusive. Some of them had seen the positive changes at Mr. Daniels' restaurant, and they wanted to be part of that transformation. Jamal and Aisha took the time to help, offering guidance and sharing their experiences, teaching others how important it was to treat everyone equally. They saw firsthand how their voices and actions were helping to shape a more accepting world, even in places where change had seemed impossible before. But despite the progress, there were still moments when Jamal and Aisha felt the weight of the fight. Not everyone agreed with them, and there were always people who didn't understand the importance of what they were doing. There were still pockets of resistance, some in their community and others in the businesses they had worked with. Every now and then, they would hear dismissive comments or see backlash, as if their efforts to bring equality into the forefront were somehow unnecessary. These moments stung, but Jamal and Aisha had learned not to let them deter them. They had a purpose, and they knew that progress wasn't always easy or quick. One day, Jamal received a message from someone he hadn't heard from in months. It was from Mr. Daniels, the restaurant owner. "I wanted to let you know that we've been doing more," the message began. "We've been holding monthly meetings with our staff to discuss diversity and making sure we're living up to our promise of inclusion. We've also started a community outreach program, and I'm proud to say that we've seen more people from all walks of life coming through our doors. I just wanted to thank you and Aisha for being the spark that helped get us here. You both have made a bigger impact than you can imagine." Jamal felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he read the message. He knew they had made a difference, but hearing it from someone who had been part of the problem meant more than words could express. It was a reminder of just how far they had come, not only with the restaurant, but in changing the way people thought about race, equality, and fairness. Mr. Daniels had turned his business around, but more importantly, he had opened his heart to the lessons Jamal and Aisha had taught him. It wasn't just about the restaurant anymore. It was about the change that was happening on a broader scale. Jamal and Aisha had become symbols of what could be accomplished when people didn't stay silent in the face of injustice. They weren't perfect, but they were committed to doing the right thing. And that was something they could stand by with pride. As they looked ahead, they knew the fight wasn't over. They knew that no matter how many victories they had, there would always be more work to do. The journey toward equality was ongoing, and it would require constant effort and dedication. But Jamal and Aisha also knew that they were part of something bigger now, a movement that had the power to create lasting change. The work they had done had touched countless lives. The restaurant wasn't just a place of business anymore. It had become a symbol of what could happen when people took a stand. The changes they had inspired would live on, not just in the restaurant, but in every person who had been moved by their story. They had proven that one act of courage could start a chain reaction, a wave of change that could not be stopped. Jamal and Aisha had come a long way from that painful evening when they had been turned away from the restaurant. They had faced their challenges head-on and used their pain as fuel for positive change. Their journey wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong, everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. They had turned their experience into a beacon of hope for others, and they were determined to keep pushing forward, ensuring that the world they were leaving behind was one where equality, fairness, and respect were the norm, not the exception. As they sat together one evening, reflecting on everything they had accomplished, Aisha smiled at Jamal, her hand resting on his. "We did it," she said, her voice full of gratitude and pride. "We made a difference." Jamal squeezed her hand gently and nodded. "And we're not done yet. This is just the beginning." And with that, they knew that no matter what came next, they had already accomplished something truly powerful. They had proven that change was possible, that voices could be heard, and that together, they could make the world a better place for everyone.